Hello and welcome to Dice Tabletop. My name is Chris and today we are finishing the Warlord Titan. Now unfortunately I've had a few setbacks, which is why this video has taken slightly longer than planned to come out, but we're all finished. Let's get ahead then and start with the Sunfury Annihilator. And here we have it. Now if you remember from the previous video, I was having a real big issue with this absolutely stinking of resin. So I have just been constantly washing it in the background, helping clean out as much stuff that's in there as possible, and it's a lot safer now. I'm still going to be wearing a mask, however, throughout all of this next process. And that is to open this up, clear out all of those supports that are in there, and make the room that we need to mount our LED in. Now this file has a big hole in the middle that's meant to hold a pin so it connects the two parts together, but because I'm printing this hollow, in the software I went in and I created loads of small little holes all around the inside of that pin. You can't see them quite too much here, but to the eye they were visible. This gave me a marker around the outside of that receiving hole for the pin, so I could come in, drill lots of little holes and then connect them in order to create this center section then that I was freely able to remove. Now unfortunately, while I was hacking off bits of plastic on the inside, I managed to create a little hole that went all the way through, so we are just going to fill that with green stuff later on. Now that we've made our access, we can get in there and pull out as much of the remaining supports as we can. Right, that has all been gutted. As well as that, I've also sanded down the edges just so I don't cut my fingers or anything. Next up then is I'm trying to think of a way of how I can mount this LED filament inside this, because it needs to go all the way down. So the idea that I came up with was just to connect it to a small piece of wood. I've got this offcut on the side for a second project that I'm not going to be using, and what I want is to have the ability to have this LED come in and out like I've got with the other one. So it was a matter of just measuring up the holes that I've got and getting some rough dimensions throughout the piece. Once I was satisfied and had an idea in mind, it was time to break the jigsaw out and cut out that little section that I needed. Now, as you can see, I did a terrible job at following the straight line that I drew. However, having this slight taper to it did end up working to my advantage. It fitted really snugly all the way down the barrel, and then to finish it off, I just rounded the tip with the sandpaper attachment of the rotary. So my idea for this is that we're going to glue the filament around the outside of this. That way then it's going to fill the top and bottom of the coils on the gun, as well as reach down to the end of the barrel. First, however, I couldn't resist connecting that LED up to a battery just to get an idea of how this might look, and I'm getting really excited now. So I purchased a 30cm LED filament for this, which turned out to be the perfect length. As you can see, the coil is exposed further on the top than it is the bottom. This allows us just to off-center that ever so slightly, and we get a really good wraparound, and as you can see, that is pretty much spot on. Now that we know where it's going to go, we can start getting this all soldered together. Now, a lot of this process is going to be exactly what I have done in previous videos. We're going to be shrink wrapping some of these connections to make sure they stay on, as well as testing a lot as we go along the way. Now, this was an entire process that I was making up on the fly. I end up doing about 2 or 3 iterations, so the final product is so much neater than what you see as we go along. But bear with me, because there's a lot to explain. So once I was happy that I had the LEDs the correct orientation, because there is a back and a front to them, I went ahead and just masking taped this in place for now. Now you're going to see that I use a lot of masking tape throughout this process, which turns out to be just as well. I want everything to be as reversible as possible, so that any upgrades or any changes that I need to make later down the line, they're very simple to do. It may not look the neatest, but it is certainly the most practical when it comes to having to work with it. Now that the LED is in place and under tension so it's not going to go anywhere, it's time to glue it down. For this, I'm going to be using some Loctite adhesive, and I'm going to be running a bead underneath that LED, and then once that is dried, coming back and running it along the sides as well, just to give it a really solid grip. Once the glue had dried, it was time to give it a test fit, where I realised I just needed to make a little hole top and bottom just to help receive the extra thickness now that's been added since we put the LED on. Happy with how that was now fitting? Let's give it a test, and we can really now start to get an idea of how this is going to look. We can see that the LED runs perfectly across the top and bottom, and as you rotate it, because you're constantly looking at the LED, that light really nicely follows and fills up all of the area it needs to. However, we do have a slight issue in that it sort of wobbles around in there. So we can see there are these two little almost tonsil type pieces in there. Why not just stick a little bit of foam either side? We're going to use those as sort of catches, and then when we slide it in, it should hook onto those and rest firmly in place, and then with an extra little bit of tug, we'll be able to pull it back out again. Now that the glue is dried, I've been able to see just how well it fits. I have needed to trim the edges of the foam ever so slightly, but as you'll see, it goes in there absolutely spot on, and it provides a real nice grip now either side to keep that LED vertical. It's now from pretty much this point onwards, I just hit issue after issue. One thing ended up perfectly snowballing into the next, but thankfully, through perseverance, I've come up with a much better redesign now of this whole circuit that you'll see as we come a little bit later on. But for now, take a walk with me through all these bumbling mistakes. The first mistake was not realizing that I'd actually soldered two female connectors together, one for the LED and one coming off the AT Tiny. So I needed to make this little bridging section that was two male connectors that could go in between. With that sorted, I wanted somewhere to hold the battery pack. Now, seeing as we had this space at the back of where I'm holding the LED that's going to slot into the back end of the gun, it's a perfect place to mount it. The chip and wires I'll then be able to house fully in the back end of the gun itself. Right, lighting all done, we can get on and start prepping this to paint. What I need to do is mask off anything that I don't want to start base coating out. This is going to include the coils top and bottom. As well as that, I wanted to leave these little recesses accessible as well. And this technique of just putting a little piece of masking tape down and then pushing it in with the back of a razor blade worked absolute wonders. And of course, we're not forgetting the parts at the front that we want to be exposed to. With the masking complete, it was then time to base coat it all, and as you're going to see later on, I've needed to put so many coats on this just to cover the translucent resin. It's amazing how much light bled through. Whilst that was drying, I could turn my attention to the back end of the weapon. Now we're following the same process as I did on the front end. We're going to be opening up that aperture using small tiny drill holes that will then end up connecting all together. That's going to enable us to get in there and rip out any supports that we don't want and create a nice opening ready to put our battery pack in. So the idea is going to be to magnetize the front and back pieces. That's going to enable me to take them apart and get the LED in and out. However, in test fitting it, I'd realized that I had not looked at the inside of the back end at all when sorting it out in the slicer. So this has now meant that I've got to come back and entirely redesign how this LED is going to work, because it is just not going to fit in there. And this is thankfully where working with masking tape has really gone in my favour. It was quite simple just to take it all off and go back to basics with it. So this piece of wood is too long. The first thing that I'm going to need to do is trim it down. And thankfully, where a mark was that I made to put the LED, that was a perfect size to reshape it to. Coming at this then with a handsaw, this wasn't too much effort to trim down. These loose wires needed attending to next, and I realised that I was able just to bend them around and get them to fit snugly at the back end of this piece of wood, so they're nice and just tucked out of the way. With that complete, I could give this all a little test fit, and that needed a little bit more expansion just on the back end around the top and bottom, just to accommodate the wires and masking tape that we put on. Now, whilst I've been working with this back end, I've always thought there's going to be enough room at the front to put the battery holder in, but there just simply wasn't. There are these two like little tonsil type pieces that stick out. They have just got to come out. Thankfully, they weren't too much of a fuss. I came in there with a sandpaper rotary tool and blasted them out the best that I could. But no matter what I did, I still couldn't quite get everything to fit. So the only thing left to do was to redesign everything that I've wired up. Now, it was a lot of trial and error, so I didn't film it, but this is the final result, and look how much smaller and more compact that is. To those of you who actually understand this stuff, you must have been screaming at my inefficiency. So I've ruled out a couple of connectors. I've been able to solder the battery pack directly to the chip itself, and like I should have done in the first instance, I swapped out the wrong connectors, so now I've got the right ones on, and that all in all has just reduced so much extra wire and faff to the point that it now fits in snugly and nothing is bunched up in there. You'll also see here the light bleed that I was on about when I just put a little base coat down on this. This needed so many more extra layers to stop that extra brightness from coming through. Magnet time next, and I'm going to be using the exact same method that I did in the previous video. We got some good space around these holes to mount them to, so I think I'm going to put about 7 or 8 in total. Both sides complete, and making sure not to make the same mistake that I did previously, which was to have magnets repel each other as opposed to attract each other, we can go ahead and put this together. And there's a little bit of wobble to it. That is just from how it's printed, unfortunately. I did try and sand these down a bit later on the best that I could, but honestly, it's not too much of an issue. There's still a really good firm fitment. So now we can move on and just base coat it all out. A lot of coats of primer later and a few tests to make sure there was no LED bleed. We are ready to move on and paint some metal tone on these. Following my usual recipe, we are using lead belcher in a really just sloppy dry brush to get a good tone all over that metal, then picking out all our accents with Balthazar Gold. With both those colours down, we can start to get a look of how this is gonna end up, and I'm getting quite excited to peel that tape off and see the glow. Before we can get the weathering applied and finish it off though, we need to connect this to the arm itself. So using my smallest drill bit, I aimed as centrally as I could on either side and put a hole right the way through that we can then test to see just how straight and accurate it is. Happy with that and not feeling any resistance or imbalance, I could go ahead, enlarge the hole and test fit our bolt. And I was really happy with this. Lining it up against the straight lines on the cutting mat revealed that it was pretty much bang on. With those holes made, it was time now to make the ones that we need to do in the back of the gun. So in order to line all of this up, I placed on top the little elbow joint we've already made, and by dabbing some paint on the back end of the file, I could push that into the hole and mark where we need to start drilling. Now, naturally, pulling this off did smear the paint ever so slightly, but you can see there at the bottom I've got that line undisturbed, so I can work off that to get my centre. Then, like before, we can move through a few different drill bits to get the size hole we need. Holes made on both sides, we can go ahead and test whether or not this bolt goes through, and if I was lucky like last time and managed to create a thread. The answer to that is no, but that's no issue, we can get that fixed later on. Time to tackle the next issue now that arose when I was working on the weapon. Putting some masking tape either side was absolutely fine to create a little bit of extra grip to put the weapon on, but as you can see, unfortunately the magnet is just not strong enough to hold all of this up when we also have the front end attached to it as well. So we are going to need to strengthen this. Now the only real way that this could be done and obviously still have it removable is just to put bigger magnets in. So I jumped on Amazon and grabbed the cheapest 1.5 centimeter magnets that I could that will be delivered as fast as they can, and as you can see, these are really strong and grippy. These are going to work perfectly. Now the reason I went with 1.5 centimeter magnets is because of these holes that I previously made. My original thought was that I was going to run wire through the body down into the arms for the weapons. Now I'm very glad I gave up on that idea, and this sort of modularity way of having the electronics inside each weapon is a much better idea. So using this leftover hole, it was a matter now of just really carefully increasing it to have it be a perfect size so the magnet can get in. Now this was a little bit fiddly because we've got the attraction of all the other magnets around that was pulling it all left, right and centre, but eventually after fiddling about with it, I was able to get this sorted out on both arms. Magnets in, the next issue that I had is that these surfaces weren't entirely flat, which was creating sort of a pivot point that the weapon could fall away from. So the solution to that was to come back on either surface and to try and get them as flat as possible. With that done, we can now see that this was much more effective at holding all of that weight and keeping that arm securely in place. Thankfully, that was the last challenge to overcome, so we can now get on and weather this. I'd also realised that I'd missed this piece of the volcano cannon from the previous video. So this process is exactly what we've done in previous videos. We're using the streaking grime, thinning that down with mineral spirits to get a really nice wash over all of these parts, and then once that's dried, we're coming in with a mineral spirit soaked sponge and getting off all the excess. If you'd like some more in-depth information about this weathering technique, click at the top there and you can watch the previous video all about weathering the Warlord Titan. Time to zoom out as much as we can because we are getting the upper sections of these arms attached to the Titan, and this will be the last piece that we need to do before we can just put it all together. So these slot really nicely onto these pistons that we've got. I almost ruined these in a previous video by making them inaccessible and they would have been stuck in place, so thankfully I corrected that mistake early on. This was really simple. All I did was put a bead of super glue around the top of the pins that receive the arm, as well as a real good coat on the inside of the upper arm itself, pushed these together and ensured that I gave it a slight wiggle as it dried so it didn't lock in place. Moving on then to what is actually the last thing that needs to be done on this Titan. Let's get this tape off and let's start painting these coils slightly. So with a little bit of tweezing, I managed to get all of this masking tape off without any bother at all. And then using a cotton bud and some mineral spirits, cleaned up some of the seepage that had gotten underneath from when we were putting the weathering wash on. Coils cleaned as well as the masking tape removed from the front of the barrel itself, we can start now putting a slight shade to this. Now transparent resin always benefits from having a slight gloss varnish to it, just to increase the transparency of it. So what I'm going to do is mix in a little bit of Blue Game Ink by Vallejo and put a couple of coats of that on, seeing how it dries and naturally building it up. We don't want to be really painting this and losing some of the light that we're going to get through it, just enough so that it's got an extra little bit of flavour to it. Once that was on, I put it to one side to dry, and it is officially time to finish the Chaos Warlord Titan. And let's look at the finished result. I started printing this roughly July, August 2023, made the channel, and we've been putting videos on this since January of 2024, and here we are, it is February 2025, and this is finished. But only its first iteration. As mentioned previously, we have 2 extra sets of armor panels that are going to go on this Warlord Titan, as well as a further 4 weapons that are going to go on this. You are not done seeing the Titan on this channel. So next up, what I'm going to do is a little bit of a debrief video with the Titan. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that went on with this. How much did it cost me? What challenges did I end up facing that you didn't see? And what other plans I have with this besides the aforementioned ones. Just before I wrap this video up then, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who is following the channel, all of your comments, all of your engagement. I know I've got a lot of people to get back to. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well in the next video. It has been really surreal to think of this idea that I was going to do, put some videos out. Hey, maybe this is going to get some traction, and it actually has. So a massive thank you. Now that this is finished and all the challenges are complete, we are going to start getting some more videos out a lot quicker, so you are going to be hearing from me very shortly. So remember, if you like this video, please drop a like. If you're not already, subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out with what we're trying to do here. If you want to see more of the Warlord Titan, there's a whole playlist for you to get stuck into. But for now, this is done, and I gotta start working on the next video. So bye for now.